Corruption is rampant. Corruption have been a major problem in the past decades and has caused different kinds of social problems. Poverty, lack of education, political dynasty. But in this film, we are going to talk about lack of transparency by the Philippine government on funds. By this Philippine government, we are both referring to the local and national, or from the very top to the list, since both are responsible and working together for the progression of a country. So lack of transparency in the allocation of funds and where it is actually spent have been a major tool used by the corrupt officials to hide their dishonesty and corruption with the country's funds. And this is one of the main cause of a country's poverty, which then will negatively affect the other aspects, like a domino effect, which can cause a slowly development of a country or even possibly no development at all. Thus, this problem needs to be investigated and studied to come up with possible solutions. There have been a lot of events where the funds for different projects and aids are being questioned, such as the unused funds in PITC PSDBM should be returned to the national coffers according to Trilon, and also when Ferdinand Marcos ran the Philippines, billions went missing, and also Aquino's Mr. Clean image skewed by Philippine pork barrel politics. So, of course, to have a realistic investigation and to achieve reliable answers, we tried to investigate the Marawi siege, which happened here in our local place, the Marawi City. So, it is one of the major calamities happened that stuck in the minds of people of Marawi. The siege has caused chaos in the city, especially to those families living in the area so-called the Ground Zero. Different buildings have been destroyed. The shelter is gone. The source of livelihood is gone. Thus, poverty arises. But we have our government who are responsible for the peace and order of our country. So the question is, are they responsible and honest enough for the aid and rehabilitation of Marawi after the siege? The siege has happened for 5 months from the month of May to October of 2017. Thus, it is the administration of the late President Rodrigo Duterte. If there is any problem, it should be based on the administration of our late President. That would be questioned, but the whole government itself, both national and local. We interviewed members of the families that have been hugely affected by the siege. Those are families that have nothing but their own lives after the siege.
Sapat po ba yung naibigay sa inyo na tulong ng gobyerno? At saka may mga pangako ba na hindi natupad ng gobyerno?
Sa mga tulong naman, sa kasagsagan ng siege at sa mga nagdaang mga isang taon during the siege, na okay lang naman yung mga fund na naitulong, may mga canned goods, pagkain, okay na yun. Pero ngayon yung mga pangako na babalik kami agad, until now wala pa rin po.
Sapat po ba yung binigay sa inyo na mga relief goods noong panahon ng Marawi siege?
Hindi pa sapat. Yung first time ng Marawi siege na hindi kami nasali sa listahan. Kaya hindi kami nakakuha ng relief na yung first time relief. May mga kaldero, kuwan, hindi kami nasali. Sa Marawi nung first time siege na wala kaming natatanggap. Nakatanggap lang kami nung naging biometric. Kasi lahat ng gagawin may dapak. Kung wala kang dapak, wala kang relief. Pero kahit na may dapak kami, kung dito sa Marawi na di kami rambumbugon kay binabasihan nila na yung list.
Sapat agito mihitabang rakano government no ko miyag Marawi siege.
Na kuan no to sapat no to na piremya kuan nami sa ground zero amya pa kuan pata dua posto agu dua walay. Na di nami ako meron. Apia so relief na sala-sala kami ay sa kami hindi makakuha sa gumsumon. So mga margas makakuha na di kami meron ako nga kami sa ito makakuha. Si sa misiwi na di gaya kuha na pagkakuha sa mga relief margas. Napiad no to kaya Taiwan sa mas gitag kuha. Kaya kersa din. Sa kuha na tira na December na kuha. Din tama ni man to na de. Tapos sa 15 kaya kuha na anak kuha na di. Sa kami na dami rin ako 15K. Kato na to, paman ang video-video bisa. Anak pa maganira na nadi.
Considering a fair and balanced investigation, we also ask for the insights of other groups of people in the society.
What are your insights about the government lack of transparency in the Philippine funds?
So, as we all know, meron tayong tinatawag natin na Commission on Auditor COA para i-promote yung transparency and accountability when it comes to Philippine funds. So, may insights regarding sa lack of transparency sa Philippine funds. It's either about one thing lang talaga yung naisip ko regarding sa lack of transparency. That means na yung mga policies and regulations in terms of accountability and transparency sa funds natin is hindi gaano strict and hindi masyado na-implement na maayos. For example is when it comes to funds, di ba nagkaroon ng issue regarding doon sa PhilHealth banner sa regarding sa funds. So the reason why merong nangyayaring ganyan is because the way the policies and regulations being implemented in terms of transparency and accountability sa Philippine funds hindi gaano pinagtutunan ng pansin.
What are your insights about the government's lack of transparency in the Philippines funds?
I think what we have to consider here is yung idea that they are government officials, that the idea behind being a government official is to give back to the community, na dapat they will do something for the community, na may gagawin sila, or they have to make projects that is for the concern of the community. Para bang they have to do everything na magbibigay ng convenience about the community. And if we're going to talk about the transparency, the lacking of transparency, I think it's one of their mandates to be transparent to the people. Kasi if they're not transparent, they're basically not doing so much for the community. I think the lack of transparency in government is very problematic. And first, na it destroys their yung pinaka workload nila is hindi nila nagagawa. They're not doing anything with their assigned task o mandate nila.
What are your observations through the current administration? Do you see any improvements throughout Marcos's administration?
Regarding the current administration, I think there's not much improvements that I can see. To think that there's high inflation rate in the Philippines right now, and to think that there are so much issues na nangyayari sa Philippines regarding of course the transparency, as I said before, and the proposal of many different unnecessary na fundings. Parang sa Senate ngayon kasi very problematic sa Senate kasi there are so much na proposal na hindi naman kailangan pero pinopropose pa rin. Just for example, the very questionable na Maharlika funds, the very questionable na confidential funds ni Sara Duterte, that's very questionable, and I think it still goes under the competence ng Marcos administration. If only Marcos administration was competent enough to question this, I don't think that these will actually be questionable at all. Regarding the whole administration, I think there's so much problem that needs to get addressed. I think the administration is not giving us what is due to us right now.
Aside from student, we also have managed to conduct an interview with a PhD professor in public administration, which is a match field for our topic.
What are your insights about the government's lack of transparency in the Philippine funds?
Okay, regarding the lack of transparency of the government funds, it is actually existing before even the previous presidents, like for example, President Estrada, President Roy Macapagal Arroyo, and other presidents. And now in this administration, like somehow they did not show how much the money collected from the people, what are their 10 points agenda when it comes to development, like in the projects, programs, and activities, or even what are their investment plans for the development in our country. Now, when it comes to the government's transparency, because they didn't give what are the exact programs, what are the exact projects, what are the exact activities of the government to the people on how they are going to elevate the lives of the people, or to the Filipino citizen, and how this government make that the high rate number of poor people will lessen or will lesser. Now, in the use of funds, the government didn't show us like how much they spend, how much they allocate for the certain projects, programs, and activities. So maybe the government should enhance on how they utilize the funds that coming from the people. The government should have an information that can actually reach to the people of which who lives in the mountains, so that we will know that the government is transparent to us in utilizing the funds.
What are your observations with the current administration? Do you see any improvements throughout Marcos administrations?
Now, to tell you honestly, I am not a fan of Marcos. And Marcos, like as we all know, that in the history of the Philippines, that his father is declared a martial law. Like in the sense that a lot of people died during the martial law. Like the graft and corruption is actually increased of the time of Marcos administration. The increased numbers of the government-owned and controlled corporation that is actually an avenue for corruption. Nowadays, now in the new administration, I cannot see any concrete programs that can actually develop to the lives of the people, that can increase the revenue of the government, that can actually gives work to the workless, and that can actually give hope to the hopeless. Now, as a matter of fact, the government is not visible for the development, like for example, for the infrastructure compared to the administration of the 30s. The 30s has a concrete plan, has a development plan up to 2040. Now, in the present administration, my comments is that he should put people who will administer in the different departments of the government that has a qualification on how to run the certain office.
In the case of Marawi siege, victims did get aid from the government, but it's not enough accordingly. There were also evacuees that have only received a little, since they do not have any relative connection with the officials or authorized persons to be part of the master list who can receive a certain aid from the government. And accordingly, homeless victims after the siege have been promised shelter, and yes, there has been an average houses built for those displaced by the siege, but some are still homeless even until now. Accordingly, the government has released roughly 5.2 billion for rehabilitation efforts as of end April 2018. According to the information from the Department of Budget Management, or the DBM, the budget may possibly not enough, since we cannot simply calculate an overall budget needed to have everyone receive enough aid from the government, but an effective allocation and honest and equal distribution will make everyone receive an equal aid, and of course, an enough rehabilitation for the affected areas in Marawi. Given the present situation of Marawi, only masjids and other few buildings were built, but the large part of it, especially the houses of many residents, were still in a wreck. This time, the officials in the administration of Marcos is now involved and responsible for it. In the case of Marawi siege, is just an example. We chose to have a reliable, realistic, and achievable investigation about Philippines government's lack of transparency in the allocation of funds. Thus, we should not only focus on it. As for the other and present situation of the Philippines, according to the interviewees,
Ano po ba yung masasabi nyo sa improvement ng rehabilitation ng Ground Zero sa pinangako ng government?
Yung rehabilitation po, okay naman. Maganda yung kinalabasan kasi yung kalsada patuloy pa rin po pinadi-develop na umangat yung Ground Zero. Pero ang hindi lang, ang karamihan kasi, yung bahay po na nawala, yun po yung punto na hinihingi pa rin hanggang ngayon.
Ano yung mga improvements na nakita mo sa itong current na administration ni Marcos?
Sa ngayon po, wala pa po. Yung totoo, wala pa po kasi kahit kaming mga purpose, ang daming natanggal, ang daming nawalan ng cash card na hindi namin alam, kahit ML namin hindi ma-explain bakit walang laman.
Miagdam so billions budget government para sa rehabilitation din na para sa Kapukapia sa Marawi.
So kami ron na din maalin. Okay, na so mga project kira na detaro mga eskwela na agukasya din na gito.
Ito na imiagdam ka kuan mga improvements. Sige, kuan na Marcos ni Marcos.
Kay Marcos. Ay problema ko na detaro taman sa purpose na simulang naging Marcos na nalilit so kaya purpose. Na ayos man sa purpose na ya beneficiary pa man na kibo ko karaganan. Lagi do pa mo mga Ground Zero, ay kirang mo pa magpakabot na sa purpose. Problema man taw na zero balance. Madidipong ko panahon ni Duterte ka, STD so so kay gusto bonus. STD na iman to na parang minsan na streeta kaadnap ko doon. Na so kung sino pang nangangailangan na yung pang nawawala. Na yung kung sinong hindi nangangailangan na yan, yun ang nandun. Na yun ang masakit kasi dapat pag ilay tanong so pura nangangailangan.
answers of the interviewees is enough support to say that the Philippine government does lack transparency on the funds of the country. And we can see from their insights that it negatively affects the majority and mostly see lack of transparency by the government in the allocated funds is unethical. There have been many situations where the government funds for the country have been questioned since the citizens have the right to know as it is their money. One main reason for lacking transparency in the allocation of funds is to secretly acquire the money for the people, or in short, corruption. Ethically evaluating in the terms of its consequences, it is wrong because the greatest happiness caused by it, which is acquiring a part of a fund, is only beneficial to the corrupt officials, and thus not beneficial to the Philippine citizens, which is the greatest amount of people. In the terms of their intention, it is wrong because eating people's money defeats the purpose of funds, which is budget used for the whole citizens and for the progression of the whole country, and also the intention is not aligned with the purpose of the people, which is to raise the revenue of the government fund. Thus, they have the right to know how their contributed money is being allocated and used. Considering their motivation, it is wrong because the situation generates a personal maxim of, when I govern, I should not let people fully see where the allocated funds are spent. The statement has a contradiction where the word govern loses its meaning. There is a government to lead the country into peace and progression. Thus, govern means to be responsible and honest, to lead people and country into peace and order and progression. Not being transparent or lacking in transparency to those people in the allocating of funds means you are not responsible and honest enough. Thus, when they govern, it is not a duty to not become transparent in the allocating of funds and where it is spent. Therefore, when I govern, I should let people fully see where the allocated funds are spent. In terms of contribution to character building, it is wrong because not being transparent habitually will build a character of being deceitful. Deceitful is a deficient vice in relation to the virtue of honesty. But there are some situations where the government intentionally has a secrecy about a certain project where funds will be needed, worrying that some citizens might disagree about it. Thus, their intention is for a peaceful situation and for the assurance of the completion of a certain project which is beneficial to the majority. So in terms of its consequences, it is right because this certain project is beneficial to the majority or the greatest amount of people. Thus, in utilitarianism, it is ethical. But the same with the ethical evaluation of the first case, using the rest of the ethical standard theories, it is still unethical. In Kantian ethics, there is a contradiction, which is the purpose of governing for a peaceful and progressive country is for the whole citizens, not for the majority only. Overall, most of the perspectives said purposes that not being transparent for any reason is unethical. Therefore, the government's intentional lacks of transparency in the allocation of funds is unethical. This needs to be lessened or, if possible, prevented. Some of the recommended solutions are funds.
Now, in the Department of Interior and Local Government, they have actually mandated to the local government units that they will have a full disclosure board. Now, this full disclosure board is actually one of the requirement of the DALG to the LGU to the PLGU, that they should be transparent to the people. What are the necessary things that the full disclosure board should put in the bulletin board or full disclosure board is just all the transaction of the government, like for example, in the financial, in having a manpower, all the activities, and so on. Now, the government should have a portal, should have, diba, we have that PT4 that is actually owned by the government, that all the transaction of the government will be reported of that television. We have also the AM and FM station in the radio and the FM station owned by the government. Now, those things that I've mentioned, the government should declare what are the expenses of the government, what are the programs, what are the projects, what are the activities of the government for this year, and how much the government will spend for the programs, for the projects, and for the activities of the government. Now, that would be my recommendation, that the government will be transparent to the constituents. And aside from that the government should have an information drive on how they utilize the funds that come from the people. And that thing, the government will be more transparent to us.
Maybe to implement or to strengthen yung use ng technology, for example, is implementing e-government where Filipino citizens can access yung mga services ng government, especially so that they can parang makita nila yung kung saan man nagagamit yung mga funds ng Philippines and what are the services na nire-render ng Philippines, so that meron silang further information regarding the funds of the Philippines, which is actually very important for us, the Filipino citizens.
There's only one thing that I can recommend. Way back when Lena Robredo was a congresswoman, she was able to propose to the Senate or to the plenary the idea or the bill that talks about transparency, and I think we have to adopt that. And if we are going to adopt that, if we could just adopt that, I think that there will be less. I don't think kasi that there will be no problems in transparency, but in fairness, if we're going to adopt that transparency bill, I think we can lessen the problems in the transparency, the questionable transparency of the government. And I think that's the only solution or recommended solution that I can think of right now. Thank you.
The best solution that we could recommend is to establish an organization like Transparency International, founded by Peter Egan in 1993. In a national level, having an assured, responsible, honest, and fair members, since the goal is combating corruption, especially by pushing the greater transparency.